He was supposed to inherit my grandmother's estate. That's what she had always promised me. Alexandra, she'd say, her frail fingers curling around mine. When I'm gone, the beach house will be yours. It's where you belong. For 15 years, I was the one who drove 3 hours every weekend to care for her. He was the one who organized her medications, scheduled her doctor's appointments, and listened to the same stories about her youth in St. Petersburg over and over, nodding as if each telling was the first. My brother, Victor, called maybe twice a year, Christmas and her birthday. 10-minute conversations, tops. I'm busy building my career, he'd tell me when I'd gently suggest he visit more often. You have more time for this stuff. This stuff was our grandmother's life, her dignity, her comfort in her final years. The day she passed, I was holding her hand. Victor was in Aspen skiing with friends. He didn't make it back for 3 days, not even in time for the funeral arrangements I had to handle alone. Sorry, he texted. Got in a storm. Flight's delayed. He didn't have the energy to be angry. Grief had hollowed me out. All he could think about was how quiet her house was now, how the space that had been filled with her perfume and her Russian folk music and her laughter was now just empty. Victor arrived the day before the funeral, tanned and relaxed. He hugged me briefly, asked if there was decent coffee in this backwater town, and then disappeared to check into his hotel. Not her house now, I thought, but an overpriced resort by the water. The funeral was small but beautiful. I'd arranged for her favorite lilies, for a choir to sing the Orthodox hymns she loved. He delivered the eulogy with my voice barely cracking, sharing stories of her courage, her humor, her endless compassion. Victor sat in the front row, checking his watch. 3 days later, we met with her attorney, Mr. Coleman. His office smelled like leather and lemon polish, and late morning sunlight streamed through tall windows. He sat with my hands folded in my lap, exhausted but ready to handle whatever came next. He already had plans for the beach house and not to sell it. Never that, but to preserve it, to maybe rent it out during peak season to cover the taxes and maintenance. Shall we begin? Mr. Coleman said, adjusting his glasses. He opened a thick folder stamped with my grandmother's name, Anastasia Petrova. He nodded, and he began to read. The first few paragraphs were standard legal language, but I sat up straighter when he got to the distributions. To my beloved grandson Victor Sokolov, I leave my property at 421 Ocean Drive, valued at approximately 3,2 million, along with all furnishings and personal items contained therein. The room tilted. I gripped the arms of my chair, certain I had misheard. To my granddaughter, Alexandra Sokolov, I leave the sum of $15,000 in recognition of her companionship over the years. $15,000. The beach house, her beach house, the one where I had spent countless weekends caring for her, the one she had repeatedly promised would be Minowa's going to Victor. Victor, who couldn't be bothered to visit her more than twice a year. Victor, who didn't even know which medications she took or that she couldn't eat strawberries because they gave her hives. There must be a mistake, I said, my voice sounding far away. She always told me the house would be mine. Mr. Coleman cleared his throat uncomfortably. This is the most recent will, signed and notarized 6 months ago. He slid a document across the table, showing her signature hackier than I remembered, but unmistakably hers. Victor was perfectly still beside me, but I could feel a change in the air, like the static before a storm. When I looked at him, the corner of his mouth was turned up in what might have been mistaken for grief, but what I recognized as satisfaction. Did you know about this? I asked him quietly. She mentioned she was updating her will, he said with a small shrug. I didn't ask for details, but there was something in his eyes, a gleam of triumph, of calculation that made my stomach clench. Later I would recognize that moment as the first fracture in the foundation of my world, the beginning of an avalanche that would bury everything I thought I knew about my family. He drove home in a fog, my thoughts scattered and sharp-edged. The small apartment I rented suddenly felt like a betrayal. He should have been returning to Ocean Drive, to high ceilings and the sound of waves crashing against the shore. Instead, I was fumbling with the sticky lock, on a door that opened to reveal a space so cramped I could see my entire life from the threshold. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking of my grandmother's face, how she would smile at me when I arrived on Fridays. "My Sasha," she would say, using the Russian diminutive of my name. "You are the only one who remembers me." Had that been Ali? Had our connection, which I'd thought was unbreakable, been nothing more than my delusion? He called in sick to work the next day, and the next. By the third day, my boss called me. "Alexandra, I understand you're grieving, but we need you back. The Richardson account is falling apart without you." He promised to return on Monday. What else could I do? Unlike Victor, who had a trust fund from our parents and a job at our father's firm that paid him triple my salary for half the work, I needed my income. The $15,000 from my grandmother would barely cover 3 months of living expenses. It certainly wouldn't allow me to buy property anywhere, let alone somewhere as expensive as the coast. On Sunday evening, I forced myself into the shower, washing away days of tears and confusion. As the hot water beat against my back, something shifted inside me. The numbness that had enveloped me since the reading of the will began to crack, revealing a growing anger beneath. Why had my grandmother changed her will? What had Victor said or done to influence her? I needed answers. My first stop was Mr. Coleman's office, early Monday morning before work. He seemed surprised to see me again, but invited me in. "I need to know when exactly my grandmother changed her will," I said, sitting in the same chair I'd occupied days earlier. "And I need to know why." He frowned slightly, thumbing through files on his desk. The new will was executed on February Coxito's death. As for why, Miss Sokolov, I can only tell you what's in the document, not the reasoning behind it. Was she of sound mind? I pressed. She was 8 years old. She had days where she was confused, where she thought I was my mother. She was evaluated by 2 independent physicians before signing, he replied, his tone formal. Both certified her as competent to make legal decisions. He nodded slowly, processing this. "Who arranged for those evaluations?" A flicker of hesitation crossed his face. "Your brother contacted my office about updating the will. Standard procedure is to ensure all parties are mentally fit to make changes, especially at her age." There it was. Victor had initiated the changes. The question was why, and how he had convinced her. My next visit was to Dr. Morris, my grandmother's primary physician for the past decade. His office was warm and cluttered, with faded diplomas on the walls, and a perpetually overflowing inbox on his desk. "Alexandra," he said, genuine concern in his eyes. "I was so sorry to hear about Anastasia. How are you holding up?" "Not well," I admitted. "I've just found out my grandmother changed her will dramatically before she died, and I'm trying to understand why." He nodded sympathetically. "I can't discuss her medical information, you know that. He was her caretaker for 15 years. I reminded him. "I have copies of her medical power of attorney, which expired upon her death," he said, gently. I took a deep breath. "I'm not asking for protected information. I just want to know if you noticed any changes in her in the months before she died. Was she more confused? More susceptible to suggestion?" He leaned back in his chair, considering my question. "I can say that your grandmother had good days and bad days, like many patients her age. Cognitive fluctuations are common. And on February Coxito's death, what kind of day was that?" His eyes narrowed slightly. "How do you know that specific date?" "It's when she changed her will." He was silent for a long moment. "I wasn't her attending physician that day. She had an appointment with a specialist, a neurologist, I believe. Your brother brought her in." Another piece of the puzzle. Victor, who barely showed up for holidays, had suddenly taken our grandmother to medical appointments I knew nothing about. "Did you refer her to this neurologist?" "No," Dr. Morris said, frowning. "That was arranged privately." I thanked him and left, my mind racing. The picture forming was one I didn't want to see, but I couldn't look away from it either. Victor had orchestrated the entire thing, the new doctors, the new will, all of it happening without my knowledge. But why? The Beak house was valuable, certainly, but Victor wasn't hurting for money. Our parents had left him well provided for after their accident, and his investment portfolio was substantial. What made my grandmother's property so important that he would go to such lengths to secure it? I drove to Ocean Drive, pulling up to the familiar white house with blue shutters. The pain of seeing it, knowing it was no longer connected to me in any way, was sharp but clarifying. He sat in my car, staring at the wind chimes my grandmother and I had hung together on the porch, listening to them sing in the coastal breeze. A sleek black Audi pulled into the driveway Victor's car. I hadn't planned on confronting him today, but maybe this was better. Raw, unplanned, real. He got out of my car just as he was unlocking the front door. Sasha, he said, genuinely surprised. What are you doing here? He came to understand why my grandmother would suddenly change her mind about who should have this house. I said, not bothering with pleasantries. The house she promised me for 15 years. His Sighead, pushing the door open and gesturing for me to come inside. You should have called first. The interior was already different. My grandmother's crocheted throws were gone from the sofa, replaced by sleek modern pillows. The shelf that had held her collection of Fabergé egg replicas was empty. Where are her things? I asked, my voice tight. In storage, Hay said smoothly. I'm having the place updated. The decorator is coming tomorrow to measure for new drapes. The casual dismissal of our grandmother's taste, her memories, her life made something inside me snap. Why did you do it, Victor? Why did you manipulate an old woman into giving you something she had promised to me? Hello had actually lauhed and the sound of it killed me. Manipulate? That's rich, coming from you. Who do you think spent 15 years guilt-tripping her? Making her dependent? Playing the dutiful granddaughter while painting me as the villain. I cared for her because I loved her, I said, my voice rising. Because someone had to make sure she took her heart medication and didn't fall in the shower. Where were you when she needed help? Building a life, he shot back. Not hanging around waiting for an inheritance. The accusation was so backward, so perverse that I could only stare at him. Is that what you think I was doing? I think, he said, his voice dropping to something dangerous and quiet, that you've always resented me. Ever since we were kids. Ever since Mom and Dad died and the estate was divided. You got less because you were younger, and you've been bitter about it ever since. I shook my head, disbelieving. That's not true. I never cared about the money. Everyone cares about the money, Sasha. The difference is, I'm honest about it. So you admit it? You convinced her to change her will when she was vulnerable? He walked to what had been our grandmother's bar cart, now stocked with his preferred top-shelf spirits, and poured himself a whiskey. I convinced her to be fair. This property is going to be worth double in 5 years, once the new marina is built. It's an investment that would be wasted on you. Wasted? I repeated, the word tasting bitter. What would you do with it? Keep it as some kind of shrine. I'm going to develop it, renovate and flip it, or maybe tear it down and build something modern. Either way, it's a business decision. It was her home. I said, my voice breaking. Our grandmother's home. It's real estate, he corrected, taking a sip of his drink, and now it's mine. He looked around the room, at the spaces being systematically erased of my grandmother's presence, and realized there was nothing left for me here. No comfort, no answers. Just the cold reality that my brother had always seen our family not as people to love but as assets to manage. I hope it's worth it, I said quietly, walking toward the door. I hope when you're lying awake at night, the money keeps you warm. He didn't answer, and I didn't look back. Over the next few weeks, I tried to move forward. I threw myself into work, stayed late at the office, took on extra clients. Anything to keep my mind occupied, to stop the endless loop of betrayal and confusion that haunted me. Then came the letter. It arrived at my apartment on a Tuesday, a plain white envelope with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a small key. I recognized immediately the key to my grandmother's safe deposit box at First National Bank. The note was brief, written in a shakehand I knew well. Mudearest Sasha, if you are reading this, I am gone, and things have not gone as I wished. Victor came to me with papers, with doctors. I was confused. I am so sorry. The truth is in box 247. Remember that I always loved you best. Your babushka Anastasia. My hands trembled as I read and reread the note. It was dated February 3 days after the new will was signed. She had known something was wrong, had tried to leave me a clue, a way to fight back. The next morning, I went to the bank. Box 247 contained several items: a small diary, a USB drive, and another envelope. I took them home before examining them, my heart racing with a mixture of hope and dread. The diary was my grandmother's, her thoughts recorded in a mixture of English and Russian. The entries from January and February were especially illuminating. She wrote about Victor's sudden increased presence in her life, about doctors she didn't remember agreeing to see, about vitamins that made her feel strange and foggy. The USB drive contained recorded conversations my grandmother had apparently been in the habit of recording phone calls in her later years, something I hadn't known. In one file, dated February 9th, Victor could be heard clearly. It's just a formality, babushka. The doctors are just to verify you're of sound mind when you sign the new papers. Alexandra doesn't need to know, it would only upset her. She's so emotional about these things. My grandmother's voice, confused. But I promised Sasha the house. She's the one who takes care of me. And we'll make sure she's provided for. Victor assured her smoothly, but the house is a valuable asset. It needs proper management. You understand business, don't you? Like Papa taught us. The final envelope contained a bombshell. A letter from Coastal Development LLC, dated January expressing interest in purchasing the entire block of beachfront property on Ocean Drive for a luxury resort complex. The offer was substantial, nearly double the current market value of each home. Victor's name was CC'd on the correspondence. It all made sense now. This wasn't about the house itself or even its current value. This was about a massive development deal that Victor had been orchestrating, possibly for months or years. My grandmother's property was the cornerstone, the piece had needed to make everything fall into place. And he had manipulated her, possibly even drugged her, to get it. That night, I couldn't sleep. I paced my small apartment, fuming with a rage so pure it felt like electricity in my veins. This wasn't just about an inheritance anymore. This was about justice. About truth. About honoring my grandmother's real wishes, not the fiction Victor had engineered. The next morning, I called in sick again and made 3 appointments. First with a different attorney, one with no connection to my family, then with the county prosecutor's office, and finally with a journalist at the local paper who specialized in real estate development stories. He brought copies of everything: the diary, the recordings, the development letter, my grandmother's note. He laid out the timeline, showing how Victor had orchestrated the entire scheme to gain control of a property worth millions more than anyone realized. The attorney, Miss Paddle, listened intently, taking detailed notes. "This is complicated," she said when I finished my story. "Contesting a will is always difficult, but you have substantial evidence of undue influence, possibly even elder abuse. The recordings alone raise serious questions. I don't just want the will overturned," I told her. "I want Victor held accountable. What he did was criminal." She nodded thoughtfully. "Let's start with a temporary injunction to prevent any sale or development of the property while this is investigated. Then we'll proceed with both the civil case to contest the will and assist the prosecutor's office with potential criminal charges." The prosecutor, a serious man named Ramirez, was especially interested in the medical aspects. "These vitamins you mentioned, need to subpoena your grandmother's medical records, possibly even request testing of any remaining medications at the house." "Do whatever you need to do," I said firmly. "My grandmother deserves justice." The journalist, Emma Chen, was perhaps the most immediately enthusiastic. "This story has everything," she said, eyes bright with professional excitement. "Elder abuse, real estate corruption, family drama. Are you sure you're ready for this to go public? It won't be pretty." He thought about my grandmother, about how Victor had counted on my silence, on my desire to avoid conflict. How that silence had allowed him to nearly get away with his scheme. "I'm ready," I said. "The truth deserves to be heard." The next few months were a blur of legal meetings, depositions, and increasing public scrutiny. Emma's initial article, titled "Family Estate Battle Reveals Shadowy Real Estate Deal," sparked local interest that soon expanded to regional news as the details emerged. Victor, predictably, was furious. He called me the night the first article was published, his voice cold with rage. "You have no idea what you've started," he said. "I'll bury you in legal fees. I'll make sure everyone knows you're just a bitter, jealous failure trying to smear me because you got left out of the will." "Go ahead," I replied, surprised by my own calm. "Unlike you, I have nothing to hide." The truth, as it inevitably does, continued to emerge piece by piece. The neurologist who had certified my grandmother's competency turned out to be a college friend of Victor's with a history of ethical complaints. Testing of leftover medications found in her bathroom cabinet revealed traces of benzodiazepines not prescribed by any of her regular doctors. Most damning of all, Coastal Development LLC was revealed to be partly owned by Victor himself through a web of shell companies' clear conflict of interest he had hidden from everyone, including the other potential investors. 6 months after I received my grandmother's letter, the court issued its ruling. The February will was invalidated on grounds of undue influence and possible incapacitation. My grandmother's previous will, the one leaving the beach house to me, was reinstated. Victor faced more than civil consequences. The district attorney filed charges for elder abuse, fraud, and several financial crimes related to the hidden ownership of Coastal Development. His reputation in the business community, once sterling, was shattered. When I finally returned to the beach house now, legally and morally I stood on the porch and listened to the wind chimes my grandmother and I had hung together. They sung in the coastal breeze, a familiar melody that felt like her voice welcoming me home. Inside, he replaced the modern furnishings Victor had installed with my grandmother's belongings, retrieved from the storage unit where he'd hidden them. Her crocheted throws, her Fabergé egg collection, her books in Russian and English all returned to their rightful places. In her bedroom, I hung a framed copy of her note to me, the one that had started the journey to justice. "Remember that I always loved you best. Not for vanity or triumph, but as a reminder that love a real love, not the toxic manipulation Victor had specialized in leaves traces that can't be erased by legal documents or clever schemes." 1 year after my grandmother's death, I established the Anastasia Petrova Foundation for Elder Justice, using part of my inheritance and, ironically, the substantial settlement from the lawsuit against Victor and his co-conspirators. The foundation provides legal advocacy for elderly people vulnerable to exploitation, especially those with cognitive impairments. Victor eventually took a plea deal to avoid a lengthy trial. The last I heard, he was serving his sentence at a minimum security facility upstate. His empire of cards collapsed entirely. Some family members and former friends suggested I was being too harsh, that I should show mercy to my only brother despite what he'd done. "Blood is thicker than water." My Aunt Irena told me at a family gathering, her eyes pleading. "He's still your brother." The full proverb, I corrected her gently, is the blood of the covenant is thicker than the water of the womb. It means the bonds we choose, the promises we keep, are stronger than mere genetics. I thought of my grandmother then, of her courage in leaving me that key and note even when she was confused and afraid. Of the 15 years we'd spent together, building a covenant of love and trust that Victor had tried and failed to break. Some bonds can't be severed, not by manipulation or greed or even death itself. They live on in the choices we make, in the truths we defend, in the justice we fight for. My grandmother taught me that in life, and even more powerfully, in the legacy she left behind. Not just a beach house with blue shutters, but the courage to stand up for what's right no matter who stands against you.